The man in the lobby was not supposed to be there. Not according to Harlan Goss. Not according to the way Harlan saw the world, which was organized in a very particular fashion. A fashion in which some people owned things, and other people fixed them, and the two groups were never, ever confused for one another. So when Harlan looked down from the mezzanine of the acquisition ceremony, the marble, floors freshly polished, the photographers arranged, the city councilman's standing just to his left, and he saw that name on the brass placard above, the main entrance, the color left, his face in one clean sheet. He reached for the railing. His assistant said something. He didn't hear it, because the name on that placard, the name on the building he had just signed for, the building that was supposed to be the crown of his portfolio, the building he had boasted about across 3 business lunches and a charity dinner. That name was the name of the man he had called Boy, the man he had told to use the service entrance, the man he had shorted $30 on a Sunday morning, while his whole neighborhood watched through apartment windows they did not know he could feel. By the time the ceremony photographer lifted his camera, Harlan Goss's hand was shaking. Nobody in that lobby knew why. But the man whose name was on the building did, and he had known this moment was coming for a long time. There is a kind of wealth that announces itself in the lobby. There is another kind that waits in the pipes. Subscribe and tell me where you're listening from in the comments. Then let's rewind. 18 months earlier, his name was Cornelius James Beaumont. Most people in the Delmore Hill neighborhood called him Neil. His truck called him something else, a faded decal on the side panel that read Beaumont Mechanical, EST, 2003, with a phone number that was 1 digit off from the current one, because nobody had ever gotten around to reprinting the vinyl, and Neil had decided that any customer too particular about a phone number was probably not the kind of customer he wanted anyway. He was 51 years old that Tuesday morning. He pulled up to the Goss property on Wendell Avenue. He wore the same thing he wore every working day: dark canvas work pants, a gray thermal under a Beaumont Mechanical button-down, steel-toed boots that had been resoled twice. His hands were the hands of a man who had spent 30 years learning what was behind every wall in every building in this city. Wide palms, short nails, a small scar on the right index finger from a compression fitting that had slipped in 2009 when he was working a midnight emergency at a children's hospital, and he had kept working with a rag wrapped around the cut because the job was not finished. He had a thermos of coffee in the cup holder. He had a clipboard. On the clipboard was a work order. Emergency call. Building at 1147 Wendell Avenue. Tenant reporting no hot water on floors 3 through 7. He had seen this building before. Everyone in the trades had. It was a 6-story residential, mid-century bones, a patchwork of retrofit plumbing that 3 different contractors had layered over the original risers across 6 decades of additions, and workarounds and shortcuts. It was exactly the kind of building Neil Beaumont loved and everyone else dreaded, because it required you to know not just what the blueprint said, but what the building had actually become over time. 60 years of decisions, 60 years of someone's good idea and someone else's cheap fix and someone else's 2 in the morning judgment call. 60 years of a building slowly becoming its own history. Neil Beaumont knew buildings like this the way a surgeon knows the body. Not just the anatomy, the history, the complications, the compensations one system made for the failures of another. He could look at a copper fitting and estimate within 2 years when it was installed. He could hear a pressure irregularity in a riser from the sound of the tap 3 floors above it. He could walk into a mechanical room he had never seen and read, in 30 seconds, 3 things the building had been told for years and had never been allowed to say. He parked the truck at the curb. He pulled his service bag from the bed. He walked to the front entrance. There was a doorman, a young man named Darius, maybe 23, who recognized Neil immediately and held the glass door open with both hands and said, "Morning, Mr. Beaumont, 3rd floor and up, sir." "Thank you, son," Neil said. That was the kind of man he was. He had been in this business since he was 19 years old, when his uncle Preston had handed him a pipe wrench in a crawl space under a duplex in the Westbrook district and said, "I am going to teach you something that will never leave you, and that no one can ever take from you, and that will serve you better than anything else. I know." His Uncle Preston had been right about that. His Uncle Preston had been right about most things. He had been a master plumber for 31 years before. Arthritis ended his working career, and in those 31 years he had trained 4 apprentices, and of the 4 apprentices, Neil was the one he talked about most. Neil had apprenticed under him for 4 years. He had earned his journeyman's license in 1994, the week before his Uncle Preston's 55th birthday, and he had framed the license and brought it to the birthday party, and his Uncle Preston had held it in both hands for a long time without saying anything, and then had said, "Now it's yours. Now it belongs to you." He had earned his master's certification in 1998 at 35. He had passed the exam on the first attempt, which was not uncommon, but he had passed it with a score of 94, which was, he had worked for 2 firms after his journeyman years. Murray Brothers Mechanical, 4 years, then a commercial outfit called Reliant Service Group for 3. Learning the business side of the trade, understanding how bids were structured and how accounts were managed, and how a company grew or didn't grow, depending on the difference between the quality of the work and the quality of the paperwork. He paid attention to both. He was the kind of apprentice and journeyman and employee that every firm hoped for, and most firms only approximated. Attentive, reliable, technically excellent, and constitutionally incapable of leaving a job incomplete. He had opened Beaumont Mechanical in 2003 with a second-hand van, a used pipe threader he had bought from Murray Brothers when they upgraded their equipment, and a list of 23 contacts he had built by doing work so clean and so correct that people called him back without checking prices first. He had written the company name on the van himself in red vinyl letters. He had cut at a print shop on Dorchester Avenue, and he had driven to his Aunt Loretta's house and parked in front of it, and she had come out on the porch and put her hand over her mouth and then said, Preston would have wept. In the 21 years since, Beaumont Mechanical had grown by exactly the amount Neil intended. Not faster, not slower. Every hire was deliberate. Every account was chosen. He had turned down contracts that would have required him to cut corners on labor, on materials, on time. He had turned down a regional franchise arrangement in 2015 that a business development consultant had described with genuine enthusiasm as a seven-figure opportunity, and he had turned it down because it required him to put his name on work he could not personally oversee, and he was not willing to do that at any price. By 2024, Beaumont Mechanical employed 11 people. 7 of them were fully licensed. 4 of them he had trained personally, including his nephew Darnell, who was now the best pipe-fitting troubleshooter in the eastern half of the city, and who refused to acknowledge this fact out loud because he found modesty more interesting than praise, and also because his uncle had taught him that the work was the answer and the rest was noise. The company had 81 active commercial accounts. It had completed over 400 residential jobs in the prior calendar year. It had a 9-star rating across all review platforms, which Neil neither monitored nor cared about, because the work itself was the rating, and the rating that mattered was the one inside the wall, behind the fitting, at the joint where no customer ever looked and where he would not allow anything but correct. He had a personal checking account that most of his neighbors would not have believed. He had 2 investment properties in the Haverford district, both fully tenanted, both maintained with the same precision he brought to every building he touched. He had a mutual fund portfolio that his accountant Patricia Wells described, with her particular brand of professional understatement, as ahead of schedule, and then, after a brief pause, by quite a bit. He had a framed copy of his master plumber's license on the wall of his office, next to a photograph of his Uncle Preston at the birthday party, holding the framed journeyman's license in both hands. And next to that, tacked without a frame, a handwritten letter from a woman named Dorothy Sims, who had been 83 years old and had called him at 7 in the morning because her basement was flooding, and he had come within the hour and worked for 4 hours in her basement, and when he was done and she asked what she owed him, he had told her nothing because she was on a fixed income, and the repair had taken him 40 minutes, and the rest had been talking with her about her late husband, who had been a carpenter, and about her daughter in Portland, and a peach cobbler she had made for a church fundraiser in 1987, and she had written him a letter by hand and mailed it to the office address. And it ended with the words, "You are what good looks like." He kept that note because he agreed with her, not about himself, about the idea, about what good looked like when it wasn't performing for anyone. He was a quiet man who loved his work and asked nothing from the world except the chance to do it well and correctly and completely. He did not talk about money. He did not talk about what he had built. He wore the work pants and the gray thermal because they were comfortable and practical, and the work required both. And he had never once in 51 years on this earth dressed to be seen. He dressed to work. The distinction mattered to him in a way he could not entirely explain, and had never been asked to. That Tuesday morning, he found the problem in 40 minutes. A cross-linked segment in the third-floor supply riser, a failing gate valve that someone had capped rather than replaced during a remodel 8 years prior, and a pressure imbalance that was starving every fixture above it of the heat it needed. 46 apartments. 3 days without hot water. A fix that would take him 90 minutes total, and that should have been made in 2016, when the last contractor had capped the valve rather than replacing it, a decision that had cost $32 in avoided parts and had now cost 46 families 3 days of cold water and a Sunday of inconvenience for Neil Beaumont. He photographed everything. He documented the capped valve with 3 photographs from different angles. He wrote a materials list. He wrote the serial number on the compromised valve and cross-referenced it against the building's apparent retrofit timeline to establish approximately when the problem had originated. He did this not because anyone would ever ask him for this level of documentation, but because the record was the record, and the record should be complete. He began the repair. He was on his back under a utility sink on the 4th floor, torque wrench in hand, when the elevator opened at the end of the hallway, and Harlan Goss walked in. Harlan Goss was 58, broad across the shoulders, the kind of broad that comes from a gym membership used 3 times a week and referenced at dinner parties. He wore a charcoal suit on a Tuesday morning the way other men wore jeans. Casually, as a matter of course, because the suit was an argument he was always making. A continuous argument that required no opening statement. He had the deep tan of a man who vacationed on purpose and who understood that the appearance of leisure was its own form of communication. He had the haircut of a man whose barber came to him. He owned, at that point, 14 commercial and residential properties in the city, including the building at 1147 Wendell Avenue, which he had acquired 18 months prior as part of a portfolio package from a retiring developer, and which he had not visited in person in 4 months. He knew its address. He knew its rent roll. He did not know the name of the gate valve on the 3rd floor riser. He did not know the name of the doorman. He did not know how many apartments had been without hot water, or for how long, or what it felt like to shower in cold water for 3 days in November. He did not see Neil Beaumont when he walked into the hallway. He saw a pair of work boots sticking out from under a utility cabinet. "Who called a plumber?" he said, to no one in particular. His property manager, a tired-looking man named Gill, who had materialized from a doorway behind him, said, "Tenant, calls on floors 3 through 7, sir. No hot water since Sunday. We needed to bring someone in." "I have a contractor," Harlan said. "Your contractor was unavailable, sir," Gill said. "3rd time this year." Harlan looked at the work boots. He looked at the truck logo on the canvas bag propped against the wall. Beaumont Mechanical, EST 2003. He said the name out loud the way someone says a word in a foreign language they have encountered for the first time. Beaumont Mechanical. He took out his phone and typed it. He found the website. Simple, functional, undesigned. The website of a company that had decided years ago that the quality of the work was a better advertisement than any design. And he read the service area and the license numbers and the certifications and the short paragraph about commercial accounts that managed to convey, without once saying so directly, that this company was selective about the work it took on. He looked back at the boots. He said, loudly, to the boots, "How long is this going to take?" It was not a question. It was a complaint wearing a question's clothes. Neil slid out from under the cabinet. He stood up. He was not a small man, 6 feet even, square through the shoulders in a way that the gray thermal neither announced nor concealed, simply was. He looked at Harlan Goss with the patience of a man who had been looked at the wrong way enough times to have stopped taking it personally and started filing it instead. "Valve needs to be replaced," Neil said. "I have the part on the truck. Another 45 minutes, give or take." Harlan looked him up and down, the slow look, the look that was also an assessment, and also a verdict all in one pass. He said, "Use the service entrance from now on. Front lobby is for residents." There was a silence in that hallway that had a particular quality, the quality of something being recorded. Not on a phone, in a memory, in the specific and accurate memory of a man who knew exactly what he had just heard and what it meant and what it said about the person who had said it. Darnell, who had come up from the basement to assist, had gone very still in the doorway at the end of the hall. He was 27 years old, and he had been working with his uncle for 4 years. And he had learned, in those 4 years, to read the temperature of a room the way Neil had taught him, to read the temperature of a pipe, not with a gauge, but with attention. The temperature in this hallway was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the broken valve. Gil was looking at the floor. Gil was looking at the floor because he had worked for Harlan Goss for 3 years, and he knew the shape of what had just happened, and he was ashamed that he had not said anything, and he would be ashamed of that for a long time. Neil Beaumont looked at Harlan Goss for a long, clear moment, not with anger, with something much quieter than anger, with the expression of a man who is completing a file, who is placing a document in a drawer he has had open for 51 years, and that contains many documents, and that he keeps organized with the same precision he brings to everything else. "Understood," Neil said. He picked up his tool bag. He turned back to the repair. Harlan Goss straightened his cuffs. He said to Gil, "Make sure we get a proper invoice this time. I don't pay above market rate for neighborhood handymen." Then he walked back to the elevator, and the doors closed, and the hallway went quiet again. Darnell came down slowly. He stood beside his uncle. Neil was already back under the cabinet. "You want to say something?" Neil said. It was not a question either. "No, sir," Darnell said. "Good. Hand me the half-inch." The repair took 38 more minutes. Every floor above the third had hot water by 11:15. Every shower in every one of those 46 apartments ran hot. 46 families who had started the morning expecting another cold Tuesday ended it differently. Neil filed the invoice for $640, which was not above market rate. It was, in fact, $4 below the going rate, for a same-day seek emergency valve replacement in a commercial residential building, which Neil knew because he checked the market rate before every invoice and priced himself precisely at it. No more and no less, because he was not in the business of being taken advantage of him, and he was not in the business of taking advantage. He included photographs of the failed valve, the cross-linked segment, the repair, and the post-repair pressure readings. The documentation was more complete than any city inspector would require. It was complete because complete was the standard, and the standard did not vary based on who was paying. And in the comments field of the invoice, he wrote one additional line: "Gate valve at parallel junction, 5th floor, showing early-stage corrosion. Recommend replacement within 18 months. He knew it would likely be ignored. He wrote it anyway. because the record was the record. Harlan Goss's accounts payable sent a check for $610, $30 short. No explanation, no notation, no response to the flagged note about the fifth floor valve. Neil, Beaumont deposited $610. He wrote off the $30 difference as a billing discrepancy. He moved on. He moved on because he had 11 employees and 81 accounts, and a nephew who needed guidance, and a pipe threader that was overdue for calibration and a building in Riverside he had been thinking about for 2 months. He moved on because there is a kind of dignity that requires no audience and no acknowledgement and no payment in full and no apology, a kind of dignity that is its own complete economy. But he filed Harlan Goss. He filed 1747 Wendell Avenue. He filed the comment about the service entrance and the look and the 30 missing dollars and the ignored valve and Gill's eyes on the floor and Dasnell's stillness in the doorway. He filed all of it with the same precision he brought to everything else. And the drawer closed, and he went back to work. The thing about Cornelius James Beaumont was that he had been thinking about what came next for a very long time, not in an anxious way, not in a restless way, not in the way a man thinks about escape, in the way a man thinks about a foundation before he pours it. Deliberately, without rushing, because the foundation is not where you show off. The foundation is what everything else stands on, and it either holds or it does not. And whether it holds depends entirely on what you did before anyone was watching. He had been looking at commercial property since 2019, not because his residential investments had stopped performing. They were performing better than ever. Both Haverford properties fully tenanted, one of them refinanced in 2021 at terms that his accountant Patricia described as embarrassingly favorable given the rate environment. But because he understood something that most people in his income bracket did not understand until they had already missed it. He understood that the buildings in the middle tier, the 6 to 12-story mixed-use properties in the transitional districts, the ones that had been built in the 50s and 60s and maintained inconsistently since, were being systematically undervalued by the kind of buyers who looked at a rent roll and a vacancy rate and a cap rate and thought they were looking at the whole picture. They were not looking at the whole picture. They were not looking at the pipes. Neil looked at the pipes. Neil had been looking at pipes for 30 years. And he knew, not from analysis, not from a spreadsheet, but from the particular knowledge of a man who had spent 30 years inside these buildings, which ones were being held together with deferred maintenance and institutional inertia, and which ones had bones so solid, mechanical systems so original and well-maintained, that a competent renovation would transform them into the most reliable assets in a 5-mile radius for the next 40 years. He could see this in a way that no real estate analyst working from a desk could see it. He could walk into a mechanical room and read the history of the decisions that had been made and not made in that building over 50 years. He could hear the building's health in the sound of its systems. He knew which buildings were worth more than anyone was asking, and he had been patient because patience was a professional skill he had been practicing since his Uncle Preston handed him a pipe wrench in a crawl space in 1992. He found the Whitmore building through a commercial broker named Tony Farris he had worked with on his Haverford properties. Tony called him in early 2023 with a careful kind of energy in his voice. The energy of a man who thinks he is about to say something a client will take seriously. The Whitmore, 12 stories, built 1961, Alderman Square District. The retail base ran the full ground floor. 7 commercial tenants, including a pharmacy, 2 restaurants, a law office, an accounting firm, a tailor who had been in the same unit for 22 years, and a shipping company. Floors 4 through 12 held 44 residential units. It had been owned by a single-family trust for 30 years, built by a man named Edward Whitmore, who had believed in the block when no one else did, maintained by his daughter, Evelyn, who had inherited his belief and his standards both, and it was coming to market for the first time, because Evelyn Whitmore had passed at 91, and her heirs were in 4 different states and had different relationships to sentiment, and none of them had her relationship to the building itself. The asking price was $4.8 million. Neil walked through the building alone on a Saturday morning in February. He told Tony he did not need a guide. He went in with a flashlight and his clipboard, and he spent 4 hours in that building. He went into every mechanical room on every floor. He went into the basement twice. He found the original 1961 riser drawings still framed on the wall of the boiler room in a thin glass frame that someone had put up at some point to protect them from moisture. He stood in front of those drawings for a long time. Someone had loved this building. He checked the joints. He checked the pressure at 4 different points in the domestic hot water loop. He checked the crossover configuration on floors 6, 9, and 12 and found them clean. 62 years old and running at or near original specification, maintained by someone who understood that the difference between a building that lasts and a building that doesn't is whether someone with knowledge pays attention to it over time. He walked the retail corridor and looked at the ceiling junctions. He looked at the lobby, which still had its original terrazzo floors, white and gray aggregate, worn to a patina that could not be replicated, only earned. He stood in the center of the lobby and turned around slowly. This building was right. He made an offer within the week. $4.6 million. The heirs countered at 4.75. He came back at 4.68. They accepted. What followed was 8 months of the kind of work that happens before any building is ever purchased, and that no one talks about at closing ceremonies. 3 title complications that required a real estate attorney named Sandra Klein, not Hartland Goss's Sandra Klein, a different one, a woman named Rosario Cruz, who had been practicing commercial real estate law for 24 years, and who told Neil, after the second complication was resolved, that she had not worked with a buyer who read the underlying documents this closely in a very long time. A contested easement on the south face of the building that turned out to be the vestige of a 1947 right-of-way agreement with a utility company that no longer existed, and that took 6 weeks to discharge, and a mechanical inspection conducted not by a third-party inspector, but by Neil, walking the building a second time with a formal inspection checklist and producing a 41-page report that surfaced an air handler replacement on the commercial floor that the sellers had known about and had not disclosed. He renegotiated $80,000 off the price on the strength of that report. $80,000, because he had identified the specific make and model of the failing units, the current replacement cost for VRF systems of that capacity, and the labor rate for installation in a multi-story commercial building, and he had documented all of it with the same care he brought to an invoice. The seller's attorney read the report and called Rosario Cruz and said quietly, "Your client knows what he's looking at." Rosario Cruz said, "Yes, he does." The deal closed in October 2023. Cornelius James Beaumont, doing business as Beaumont Property Group, became the owner of the Whitmore Building at 214 Alderman Square. He did not post about it. He did not send a press release. He called Patricia, who said there it is in a voice that was very quiet and very certain. He called Tony Ferris, who said, "Let me know when you're ready to look at the next one." He called Aunt Loretta, who had been cooking when he called and who turned the burner off and sat down and said, "Neil, baby." He did not mention Uncle Preston, because some things you keep for yourself. But when he hung up, he sat in his truck in the parking lot of the title company for a few minutes. And he thought about a crawl space and a pipe wrench and a man who had told him that what he was about to learn would never leave him. It had not left him. He kept the name Whitmore because the building had a history, and Evelyn Whitmore had maintained it for 30 years, and that deserved to be honored. He engaged a property management company. He began the renovation in phases, starting with the mechanical systems. Because that was always where you started, because what was inside the wall determined everything that happened on its surface, and working outward. New supply risers on floors 8 through 12, a complete domestic hot water system upgrade, a full electrical panel modernization, then the hallways, then the lobby, then a fresh exterior cleaning that brought the original brick back to a color it had not been in 20 years. He had a brass placard installed above the main entrance when the renovation was complete. Simple. Clean. The same font and proportions as the original building's exterior signage. The Whitmore, Beaumont Property Group. He was not there when it was installed. He was in the Westbrook district on a job in the same neighborhood where his Uncle Preston had handed him a wrench 32 years ago. Harlan Goss had wanted the Whitmore building for 2 years before it ever went to market. He had first identified it in 2021 through his broker Stewart, who had flagged it as a likely-to-market property, given the age of the trust and the geographic distribution of the heirs. Harlan had put it on his watch list. He had driven past it twice. He had looked at the exterior and the ground floor retail footprint and the location. Half a block from the new Alderman Square transit station that the city had funded, 3 blocks from the development corridor where infrastructure money was being committed. And he had seen what he saw in every acquisition: a number, an upside, a future that involved his name on the marquee. He had missed the sale. His broker Stewart had not been watching closely enough, and the listing had appeared and gone to contract before Harlan's team was alerted. By the time Stewart called, the deal was done. Harlan Goss did not handle this kind of information quietly. There were 2 phone calls that day that his assistant and his broker preferred not to think about afterward. He had watched the Whitmore for 13 months after the closing. Tithis. Watched it the way a man watches something he believes he should own. He watched the renovation from the street. He watched the tenant roster hold steady. He watched the building visibly improve in ways that he could see from outside. The clean brick, the new lobby glass, the retail tenants who stayed, and the one vacancy that was filled within 6 weeks of being listed. He had asked Stewart more than once whether the new owner might be moved to sell. And then, in October 2024, 13 months after Neil had closed, a developer assembling a corridor redevelopment package made contact. The Whitmore was not in the original package, but its location was ideal, and they approached Beaumont Property Group through an intermediary. Neil said he was not interested. The intermediary went back with a number. Neil's team provided a floor through Rosario Cruz. Not an offer price, not an invitation, simply a number below which the conversation was not worth having. $8.2 million. Harlan Goss, who had been looped into the corridor package as a co-investor on an adjacent parcel and who heard about the Whitmore opportunity through the developer, told Stewart to make the offer through the appropriate channels. There was a negotiation. It was conducted entirely at a remove, attorneys and brokers and intermediaries. The way these things are conducted when the numbers are large enough that neither party needs to be in the room. Neither man knew the other's name on the other side of the transaction. Or rather, Goss did not know who he was buying from. Neil Beaumont knew exactly who he was selling to. He had known since week 2 of the negotiation when the buyer's entity was identified in a disclosure document as Goss Properties, LLC, and Neil had typed the name into a search engine and found the company website, and found the portfolio, and found the address of 147 Wendell Avenue, listed under residential holdings. He had sat with that information for exactly 1 afternoon. Then he had called Rosario Cruz and said, "Let's close." The deal closed at $8.4 million. Neil's acquisition cost had been $4.68 million. His renovation investment over 13 months had been $912,000. His net, before taxes and transaction fees, was $2,808,000 on a 13-month hold. Patricia called it the cleanest trade she had seen in 20 years of accounting. Neil said, "We should talk about the Riverside building." Patricia laughed for a long time. Harlan Goss's closing ceremony was arranged for the 3rd week of November. His communications team had contacted the City Business Journal. His assistant had confirmed the city councilman's attendance. The building was to be formally relaunched as a Goss Properties asset at a small ceremony in the lobby with photographs and a brief item in the journal's commercial real estate section. He arrived in his black car on a Wednesday morning. He walked through the front entrance for the first time since the deal closed. He looked up. He saw the brass placard, the Whitmore, Beaumont Property Group. He stopped moving. His assistant kept walking for 2 steps and then stopped and turned around. The city councilman, who had arrived moments earlier and was speaking with the photographer near the center of the lobby, looked over. The photographer lowered his camera. Harlan Goss was not a man who lost composure easily. He had been in business for over 30 years. He had navigated failed acquisitions and litigation and a financial crisis and a divorce and a zoning reversal that had cost him 2 years of planning. He had developed, over those 30 years, a particular kind of executive stillness, a containment that served him well in rooms where weakness was an invitation. But he was standing in a lobby that he had just paid $8.4 million for, and the name above the door was the name of the man he had told to use the service entrance, and the drawer that Harlan kept in his mind, the one where he stored things he did not want to look at, had just come open on its own. He reached for the railing. His attorney, Sandra Klein, came to stand beside him and said his name once, quietly. He said, "Who is Beaumont?" She said, "Cornelius Beaumont, Beaumont Property Group." He was the seller, Harlan. And something moved through his face. Recognition and memory arriving together, the way they do when something you filed away without examining, it suddenly opens fully in your hands. Beaumont Mechanical on a canvas bag in a fourth-floor hallway. Work boots under a utility cabinet. A man who stood up from a floor and looked at him with an expression he had not thought about since. With patience, with precision, with the absolute absence of surprise. The service entrance. He gripped the railing. The photographer, who was a professional and who understood that whatever was happening in this man's face was not his to capture, turned to the city councilman and said something about lighting. The city councilman nodded and looked at his phone. Harlan Goss's hand was shaking. Cornelius Beaumont was not in that lobby. He was 40 minutes across the city, in the Riverside district, in the basement of a 7-story building that had just come to market, moving a flashlight along a junction line and reading what the building was trying to tell him. His phone rang. "Darnell, Uncle Neil, you see what's online?" Neil held the flashlight against the header pipe. "What's online?" "There's a clip from the ceremony, from the Whitmore." The new owner looked up at the placard, and it looks like he nearly went down, Uncle, his hand on the railing. Color gone. He stood there for almost a minute, and nobody could figure out what was happening. "Is that right?" Neil said. "I think I know who it is. From Wendell Avenue." "I know who it is," Neil said. Hand flat against the copper. Clean weld. Solid. Darnell was quiet for a moment. He said, "You knew when you sold it." Neil took the flashlight to the drain header. Checked the slope. Acceptable. Barely. "I knew a lot of things," he said. "I knew what the building was worth. I knew what I put into it. I knew when the moment was right. That's what I knew." "But you knew it was him." Neil stood up, looked, and moved to the base of the main riser. "Darnell," he said. "Sir, true wealth is what you give back when nobody's watching." A pause. "Yes, sir," Darnell said. "Go finish the Haverford walk-through. I'll be back in an hour." He put the phone in his pocket. He stood in the basement of the Riverside building for another few seconds in the quiet that only basements have, the specific quiet of a room full of pipes, a room that holds the building's entire mechanical history in its joints and fittings, and the particular sound of water moving through iron at pressure. He listened. Then he took out his clipboard and wrote down what he heard. The clip was 17 seconds. It had been posted by an attendee who described it as nothing in the caption, just the new owner of a building having an unexpected reaction to the signage of the building he had just bought. No names, no context, just a man reaching for a railing with a face that had gone somewhere most people's faces don't go in public. 40,000 views by midnight. The Business Journal reporter, who had been there for the announcement item, ran a different item instead. It took 48 hours and 3 reporting calls. One to the city's commercial transaction records, where the Whitmore sale was a matter of public record. One to Beaumont Property Group's registered office, where a woman named Greta confirmed the transaction and said, pleasantly and with finality, that Mr. Beaumont was not available for comment. One to a source in the commercial broker community who knew both the transaction history and something about 747 Wendell Avenue. The headline read, Local plumbing contractor nets $8 million on landmark Alderman Square acquisition. The subhead read, Beaumont Property Group's 13-month hold on the Whitmore building closes a chapter that started with a service call. The article was careful. It named Cornelius Beaumont. It named Beaumont Mechanical. It named the certification history, the employment figures, the 21 years in operation. It named the acquisition price, the renovation investment, the sale price. It described, in one paragraph, an emergency service call to 1147 Wendell Avenue in November of the prior year, the hot water restoration to 46 apartments, and a reported incident involving the building's ownership representative that multiple tenants on the 4th and 5th floors had described in consistent terms. The article named no one from that incident directly. It did not have to. The comments on that article climbed to 416 responses in 24 hours. The fourth comment was from an account called Delmore Hill Neighbor that said, I was a tenant on the 3rd floor that morning. I heard what happened in the hallway. Some of us didn't say anything. I've thought about that a lot since. A woman named Carla Fontaine, who had been on the 4th floor, posted a full account in the replies. She described the cold water for 3 days. She described the plumber's arrival and his manner. She used the words patient and complete, and like he had nowhere else he would rather be. She described what she had overheard from her doorway and the sound of the elevator closing. She ended her post with, I am glad the world can see the full picture now. The Plumbing Industry's Regional Trade Association newsletter ran a profile of Beaumont Mechanical the following month. It included the employment figures, the license record, the commercial account roster, and a brief financial summary of the Whitmore transaction. It included a quote from a contractor named Gene Ostroff, who had known Neil since their journeyman years. Gene said, Neil Beaumont is the best plumber I have ever worked alongside, and I have worked alongside some excellent plumbers, and it turns out he is one of the best businessmen I know. He just never talked about the second part. He said the second part would speak for itself when it was ready. The second part was ready. 6 months after the commission meeting where Marcus Webb read Cornelius Beaumont's name into the city's commercial heritage record, 4 outcomes had arranged themselves in the city's public record in a way that the Business Journal eventually compiled into a single follow-up piece. Beaumont Mechanical received inquiries from 38 new commercial clients in the 60 days following the article's publication. Neil accepted 11. The criteria were the same criteria he had always used. Buildings with real deferred maintenance, clients who wanted the complete job, work that required the kind of knowledge that 30 years produces and nothing else substitutes for. The remaining 27 he referred to 2 contractors he trusted, both younger, both trained in what he recognized as the right tradition. Beaumont Property Group, through Tony Farris, closed on the Riverside building in February. 7 stories, mixed use, bones that had been loved and then neglected for about 15 years, which meant they were recoverable rather than compromised, which was exactly the condition Neil had been looking for. The renovation began in April. The estimated hold was 24 months. Patricia had already begun the underwriting for the next one. The city's trade and vocational center formalized a plumbing apprenticeship track that had been in informal development for 2 years. They named it the Beaumont Certification Pathway in January, after the commission meeting, and the first cohort of 12 apprentices graduated in June. 2 were hired by Beaumont Mechanical directly. One of them, a young man named Marcus, 19 years old, from a neighboring county, had decided to enter the trades on the night he sat in the back row of a city hall auditorium, and heard a man describe 30 years of work without once apologizing for the way it looked, or the clothes he wore, or the door he came through. Marcus said, when the trade newsletter called him for comment, "I wanted to know what was behind the wall." That is what I decided that night. Whatever is behind the wall, I want to be the person who understands it. And 1147 Wendell Avenue sold. Harlan Goss listed it in March at a price that reflected what the market had absorbed in the months since the article. A softening of interest in buildings with documented deferred maintenance and recent negative press association. The 5th floor valve, the one Neil had flagged in the comments field of his November invoice, had failed completely in February. The failure flooded 3 units and triggered a formal housing complaint. The repair cost $42,000 and generated 2 tenant relocations and a brief appearance before the city's rental housing board. The sold in April at $600,000 below the original listing price. Patricia read Neil the address from the market listing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I noted that valve in the invoice." "I know you did," Patricia said. He said, "They should have replaced it when I flagged it." She said, "They should have." Another pause. He said, "Send. Whoever buys it a referral. They're going to need good mechanical work." Patricia laughed until she had to put the phone down for a moment. When she picked it back up, she said, "Neil Beaumont." He said, "True wealth is what you give back when nobody's watching. Send them the referral." He ended the call. He went back to the Riverside sidewalk. The work did not stop. The part that stays with me, and I want to be specific about this, because it is not the brass placard, and it is not the $3 million, and it is not the 17-second clip of a man gripping a lobby railing. The part that stays with me is the comments field. $640. A half-day repair. A work order submitted to a man who had just told him to use the service entrance. And in the comments field, one line, gate valve at parallel junction, 5th floor, showing early stage, recommend. Replacement within 18 months. He was shorted $30. He had just been publicly reminded of what some people in this city thought he was. He was standing in a hallway where a property manager had looked at the floor rather than say a word in his defense. And he still wrote the note. He still told the complete truth about what he saw. He still gave the full service to a man who deserved none of it, because the work was the work, and the standard was the standard, and neither of those things had anything to do with Harlan Goss. That is the part I keep returning to. Not because it is the most dramatic moment in this story, because it is the most revealing one. One man looked at a 12-story building and saw a number, an asset, a future return, a name on a marquee. One man looked at the pipes inside that building and saw what the building actually was: its history, its health, its potential, its truth, and spent 13 months bringing it to the condition it deserved, and then sold it for what it was actually worth to the man who thought he could afford to ignore the note in the comments field. There is a kind of knowledge that cannot be acquired from a spreadsheet. There is a kind of patience that cannot be performed. There is a kind of work that does not require an audience and does not change when the audience leaves the room. Here is what I want to ask you. Not what you should do, not what you aspire to do, what you would actually do. You have been shorted $30 by someone who just told you to use the service entrance. You have just done the complete job. You are filling out the comments field on the invoice. The valve on the 5th floor is showing early corrosion. Writing the note will take 40 seconds. The note will almost certainly be ignored. The person receiving it does not respect you and has just made that clear. Do you write the note? Drop the word complete in the comments if you would write it. Drop the word blank if you would leave it empty. There is no wrong answer here. There is only the true one, and the true one is the beginning of understanding which kind of person you are and which kind you want to be. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with one person. Not for the satisfaction of the ending, though it is satisfying, but because someone in your life right now is being told what they are worth by someone who cannot actually read the pipes, and they need to hear that the building remembers what the lobby forgets. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one, because the next story is about a woman named Irene Castillo who was told at 59 that she was too old and too slow and too far behind to ever pass the bar exam, and who walked into the same courtroom where she heard those words 3 years later, this time as the attorney of record. And the man who said them to her was the one sitting at the other table. True wealth is what you give back when nobody's watching. That is all.